This week, the new conflict in Israel came to light as Hamas attacked Israel and Israel retaliated. While the mainstream media and the radical left are pushing the left's agenda that the Palestinians are suffering, you have to understand the full picture of what's happening and why it matters. This is the Closet Conservative Podcast. If you simply look on the surface of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, you're going to hear the same message across the mainstream media outlets. You're going to hear how horrible Israel is. They're horrible for kicking people out of their homes. They're horrible for bombing places where everyday Palestinians are attempting to live in peace. You're going to hear that Israel is heartless and that they're committing crimes that should never be supported. The Democrat squad members are arguing that Israel should never be supported by the United States, and it even appears that our own president is starting to turn his back on the U.S. support of Israel. But this conflict was not something that just recently started. If you research the conflict, you're going to find some that will say the conflict started around 50 years ago, 60 years ago, but that's not entirely true. In fact, it started a long time before that, and I believe that you need to know the backstory behind the conflict to understand truly what's taking place today. This conflict started with two men, one named Isaac and one named Ishmael. Now, if you're a practicing Christian, you probably remember the names and understand the story, but what I found is that many do not understand the importance of the story to our present day. The story is that in the book of Genesis, Abraham was promised a son. His wife Sarah decided that she was not going to have children because she was getting older. And it was even though God had promised she was going to have a son. So she told Abraham to have a child with Hagar, her handmaid. When Abraham went into Hagar, they had Ishmael. And in Genesis 16 verse 12, it shares some interesting details about Ishmael. It says that Ishmael will be a wild man, that his hands would be against every man, and every man against him. It also promised that Ishmael would be a great nation, as God promised in Genesis 17. But if you study Jewish history, you'll find that the nation of Israel was born out of the second son that Abraham had, the one God promised with his wife Sarah. That son was Isaac. God's promise for Ishmael to be a great nation was not ignored. Ishmael did grow and is responsible for the settlement and nations throughout much of the Middle East. According to Muslim tradition, Ishmael and Hagar, his mother, are buried in Mecca. Now, obviously, that's tied to Muslim tradition and history. One of the descendants of Ishmael, Kedar, is where Muhammad, the founder of Islam, traced his direct descendants. So if you look at this, throughout the Middle East, they all descended from Ishmael. So now that we have established the backstory, and you can follow that timeline down through history to now, the Palestinians, they're Arabs. They're Muslim, overwhelmingly Muslim. And the Arabs have been against the Israelis for centuries, and now is no different. They believe that they are entitled to the land that Israel is in. They want the Gaza Strip. They want the West Bank. They want it all. And in fact, they want the nation of Israel completely eliminated. This is not about a peace deal, as the mainstream media and the Democrat squad and others want you to believe. This is all about the elimination of the nation of Israel. It is a long-time hatred that stems back thousands of years to the time of Abraham, to the times of the Bible. They have attacked, killed, and tortured the Jews for centuries. But we're simply here to believe that it's the Jews that are causing the issues. Now, you hear the words Palestinians and Hamas. Hamas is a terrorist organization embedded into the Palestinian group, or the Palestinian state, as a lot of people would call them. They're really one and the same. They're all Muslim. They're all there. They may not all be terrorists, but they all are Arabs. They're all of these descendants of Ishmael. That's the important thing to remember. Now, the Palestinians launched over 1,100 rockets into Israel earlier this week, and they've since sent more. They claim it is in retaliation for Israel evicting people from territory that Israel rightfully owns and controls. So for eviction, it resulted in 1,100 rockets being launched at Israel. And Israel did exactly what you would expect. They responded and defended themselves when they were attacked with rockets. Now, the mainstream media tried to push the State Department to condemn the innocent civilian death. There's an article on the Liberty Loft website that talked about that, how mainstream media outlets from around the world were trying to get the State Department to condemn the killing of civilians. But what they don't share is that the Palestinians purposefully launch their attacks from places where civilians are. They are willing to sacrifice civilians as part of their activities in attacking Israel. They launch attacks from schools, from hospitals, from family homes, other public places like this. So when Israel responds to defend itself, they come under scrutiny. Radicals like Rashida Tlaib say that Palestinians deserve to be free from Israel's violent government. Ilhan Omar tried to compare it to the George Floyd situation in Minnesota. AOC joined her with Ayanna Pressley, sharing Ayanna Pressley's speech on the congressional floor, saying that Palestinians should not be displaced in acts of violence that Israel is conducting. But they conveniently leave out the fact that Israel has offered peace deal after peace deal. Many times Israel has come to the table. They've offered deal after deal. They've offered a two-state solution. They have sacrificed multiple times. And hundreds of deaths have occurred because Israel has tried to work with the Palestinians. But each time they work on a peace deal, it does not satisfy the Palestinians. But why is that? It's not because they weren't offered what they claim they want. In fact, there was an article this week that the Palestinians, Hamas, actually approached Russia saying they were ready for a peace deal with Israel. But there never will be peace because they want Israel eliminated. They do not want the nation of Israel to exist. Now, you simply cannot believe what you're hearing on the mainstream media from the radical left about this situation. This is not about Israel being a brutal nation, as they'll claim. This is not about Israel doing anything against the Palestinians. In fact, they were attacked first this week. This is about Israel defending what is rightfully theirs. This is about Israel defending their people, and they're defending their nation, their sovereignty. This is about Israel protecting themselves. It's about a conflict that began thousands of years ago because of a lack of faith in God to do what he said he was going to do, because of a lack of a faith in a promise God made to Abraham and Sarah. Now, one thing I think that is important to note, and we don't have the whole story of what's going to happen here, but I think it's important to note that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was unable to form a new government in Israel. He was given the opportunity. He's been a strong leader for quite some time, but it's concerning that he was unable to form a new government, and now they've turned it over to the opposition to try and form a new government for Israel. And that could spell trouble for the nation in the middle of this crisis. The new government, as it's trying to form, is from the opposition, and they're willing to give up concessions in order to obtain control. It sounds like it's very similar to what's happening here in the United States, and that could be a lot of trouble for the nation of Israel. So we must be in prayer for the nation of Israel, praying for peace in the area, but we also must know the truth of the situation. If you simply believe what you're hearing on the news and in the mainstream media, you miss out on the details behind this. This is not about the Hamas and Israel. This is not about Israel torturing the Palestinians. This is about hatred for thousands of years, and it will never be resolved in our current world, in our current situation. If you're a person of faith, you understand what I'm talking about. But we simply can't turn our backs on Israel because they're defending themselves. We have to stand in support of Israel when you understand the whole story. Until next time. The Closet Conservative Podcast is a production of The Liberty Loft. Copyright The Liberty Loft 2021. You can find more shows and information on our website, www.thelibertyloft.com, or on any of our social media channels. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe to the podcast, leave a 5-star review, and share the podcast with your friends.